Good morning, children. In today's session, we shall be looking at a poem in our Beehive textbook for Standard 9. The poem is titled The Legend of the Northland. This poem has been written by Phoebe Cary, who is an American poetess. The poem, The Legend of the Northland, is a ballad. Now, what is a ballad? Ballad is a song narrating a story in short stanzas. Ballads are a part of folk culture and they have been passed on orally from one generation to the next. This poem has been divided into 16 stanzas and each stanza has 4 lines. This poem is based on the story from the Old Testament in the Bible. And the story is that of an old woman who was cursed for her greed and her indifference to charity and generosity. Now let's look at the poem in detail. The Legend of the Northland. Away, away in the Northland, where the hours of the day are few, and the nights are so long in winter that they cannot sleep them through. Here the poet introduces the place from where the story is derived, that is Northland. Now it could be any place near the North Pole. It could be Alaska, Canada, Iceland, or even Russia. But the exact place has not been specified in the poem. What the poet wishes to tell us is that in this region, during winters, the days are very short and the nights are very long. The nights are so long that people find it extremely difficult to sleep throughout the night. Where they harness the swift reindeer to the sledges when it snows, and the children look like bears' cubs in their funny furry clothes. Here the poet continues to give a description of the people of Northland. She says that when the snow falls, the people like sledging, so they tie the reindeer to the sledges, and that little children wear furry clothes that make them look like bears' cubs. They tell them a curious story. I don't believe it's true, and yet you may learn a lesson if I tell the tale to you. The poet informs how the elders tell their children strange and curious stories. Although the poet doesn't believe the story, she says that she should narrate the story nonetheless, as it had a good message for everyone. Once when the good Saint Peter lived in the world below and walked about it preaching just as he did, And then the poet begins to tell the story. The story is about Saint Peter, who is one of the disciples of Jesus Christ. When he lived on the earth, he traveled around the world preaching the words of God. He came to the door of a cottage in traveling round the earth, where a little woman was making cakes and baking them on the hearth. Now when Saint Peter was traveling, once he happened to come across a cottage. It was a wintry day, and then there he found a woman who was making cakes, and she was baking them on her hearth. Hearth refers to the fireplace. And being faint with fasting, for the day was almost done, he asked her from her store of cakes to give him a single one. Now this stanza describes a condition in which Saint Peter reached the woman's cottage. Saint Peter had been traveling throughout the day and he had been fasting, so he was very hungry and tired, and hence he asked the woman to give him a cake from the ones that she had already baked and kept on the shelf. So she made a very little cake, but as it baking lay, she looked at it and thought it seemed too large to give it away. Now had she wanted, she could have actually taken one of the cakes and given to Saint Peter, but instead of doing that, she started making a very small cake, and as it was being baked, she looked at it and thought that it looked too big to give it away for free. Therefore she needed another and still a smaller one, but it looked when she turned it over as large as the first had done. Now this woman then started to make smaller and smaller cakes, but each time when it was ready, she looked at it and she found that it was too big as the first one, and hence she was reluctant to give that cake to Saint Peter. Then she took a tiny scrap of dough and rolled it flat and baked it thin as a wafer, but she couldn't part with that. Now what did the woman do? Finally she made a wafer thin cake from an extremely small lump of dough. However, even this she could not bear to give away for free. For she said, "My cakes that seem too small when I eat of them myself are yet too large to give away." So she put them on the shelf. Now this woman reasons that the cake seemed small when she made it for her own consumption, but they seemed too big to be given away for charity. As a result, she ended up keeping all the baked cakes on the shelf and leaving Saint Peter hungry and faint as ever before. It shows her extremely greedy nature. Then good Saint Peter grew angry, for he was hungry and faint, and surely such a woman was enough to provoke a saint. Now this stanza describes Saint Peter's reaction to the woman. Basically, Saint Peter was a calm and composed person. However, he was hungry and weak, as a result of which he became very angry due to the woman's stingy nature. This woman was able to provoke a calm saint and succeeded in making him angry. So she made a very little cake, but as it baking lay, she looked at it and thought it seemed too large to give it away. Now had she wanted, she could have actually taken one of the cakes and given to Saint Peter, but instead of doing that, she started making a very small cake, and as it was being baked, she looked at it and thought that it looked too big to give it away for free. Now you shall build as the birds do, and shall get your scanty food by boring and boring and boring all day in the hard dry wood. Saint Peter cursed the little woman and deprived her of all these comforts. He said that she would have to build her own nest like birds do and dig holes into the hard woods to get worms or insects to feed herself. Then up she went through the chimney, never speaking a word, and out of the top flew a woodpecker for she was changed to a bird. Soon after St. Peter cursed her, the woman was seen going up the chimney of her house speechless, and a woodpecker could be seen flying out of her chimney. She had a scarlet cap on her head, and that was left the same, but all the rest of her clothes were burnt, black as a coal in the flame. The stanza describes how the woodpecker got a red color on its head. Now, when the woman was cursed by St. Peter, she was wearing a red cap. This red cap was left untouched, while the remaining clothes were burned to ashes in the chimney, and thus she was transformed into a black bird with a red plume. And every country schoolboy has seen her in the wood, where she lives in the trees till this very day, boring and boring for food. The poet concludes by saying that every countryside schoolboy has seen the woodpecker in the woods, pecking into the bark of the trees, searching for food to eat. Hence, this poem, though looks very simple, teaches us great values. Greedy people do not deserve the comforts and luxuries of a human life. We have been gifted with a human life, and hence it is up to us that we imbibe the qualities of kindness, fellow feeling, and empathy, and make this world a better place for everyone. Now let's move on to see the literary devices used in the poem. We begin with a rhyme scheme. Let's try to find the rhyme scheme of the first stanza. In this first stanza, away, away in the Northland, where the hours of the day are few, and the nights are so long in winter that they cannot sleep them through. We know we can see the rhyme scheme. We can find the rhyme scheme by looking at the last word of each line. So, in the first line, the last word is Northland. We assign it letter A. Second line, few, doesn't rhyme with Northland, so B. Third line, winter, doesn't rhyme with either Northland or few, so it gets letter C. Fourth line, the last word is through. It rhymes with few, so it gets the same letter. And hence we can say that the rhyme scheme of the first stanza is A, B, C, B. Now if you examine the last stanza of the poem, that is, and every country schoolboy has seen her in the wood, where she lives in the trees till this very day, boring and boring for food. Here schoolboy A, second line wood B, third line day, doesn't rhyme with any of these words, so C, and last line food, which rhymes with wood, so B. So rhyme scheme of this stanza is A, B, C, B. Now in the same manner, if you check the rhyme scheme of every stanza, you find that the entire poem has a uniform rhyme scheme, that is A, B, C, B. The literary devices used in the poem, we begin with alliteration, that is a repetition of the initial consonant sound. We have, that is, cannot sleep them through, stanza 1, where the sound the is repeated. In stanza 2, where they harness the swift reindeer, the sound is repeated. And the children look like bear's cubs, the sound is repeated. In their funny furry clothes, fur sound is repeated. In stanza 3, instances of alliteration are found in, they tell them a curious story, the sound is repeated, and yet you may learn a lesson where y and l sounds are repeated. If I tell the tale to you, t sound is repeated. Other examples of alliteration in the poem are, in stanza 5, where a little woman was making cakes, w sound is repeated, and baking them on the hearth, the sound is repeated. In stanza 6, and being faint with fasting, f sound is repeated. In stanza 8, and still a smaller one, s sound is repeated. Stanza 9, then she took a tiny scrap of dough. It is t sound that is repeated. Stanza 10, for she said, my cakes that seem too small, s sound is repeated. In stanza 13, by boring and boring and boring, b sound is repeated. The next figure of speech is repetition, where you have words being repeated for poetic impact. In stanza 1, we find away, away in the Northland, where the word away has been repeated to emphasize how distant Northland is. In stanza 9, and rolled it flat, here the word roll has been repeated to stress that the lady rolled the dough many times to make it as flat and thin as a wafer. In stanza 13, by boring and boring and boring, and again in stanza 16, boring and boring for food. Here in both these lines, the word boring has been repeated to emphasize the hard effort that the woman turned woodpecker has to make to find her food. The next figure of speech that you find in this poem is simile, which means direct comparison. The instances of simile that could be found in this poem are, and the children look like bear's cubs. Here the children who wear woolen clothes are compared to bear's cubs. Second example, baked it thin as a wafer. Here cake is compared to wafer. And the third example, black as a coal. The color of the burnt clothes of the woman is compared to that of coal. The next figure of speech that you find in this poem is enjambment. It's a new figure of speech which means running lines. Now what happens is that enjambment is that figure of speech when one line moves to the next without using any kind of punctuation mark in between. Now we know that punctuation marks play a very important role. Let me explain you with some stanzas from this poem itself. In this first stanza you find there is the punctuation mark comma used in the first and the second line, and the last line you have a semicolon being used. Now third line there is no punctuation mark. It starts there and it continues and ends in the fourth line. So we can say that enjambment could be found in stanza 1, line 3 and 4. Same way, another example, here first line there is no punctuation mark, and third line also there is no punctuation mark. So in this stanza, that is stanza 2, enjambment could be found in line 1 and 2 and line 3 and 4. Some more examples of enjambment that could be found in the poem are stanza 3, where you find the third line runs into the fourth line. So we can say that enjambment is found in line number 3 and 4. Another example, here first line runs into second line. So enjambment is found in line number 1 and 2. Another example, here the first two lines continue till the third line. So enjambment is found in stanza 10, lines 1, 2 and 3. Another one, the third line continues till the fourth line. So enjambment is found in line 3 and 4. I hope that the explanation of the poem is clear to one and all. You have been able to get a proper understanding of the poem and the various literary devices used in it. Thank you all for watching this video. Hope to see you soon in the next session.